Angela Isadora Duncan was an American dancer, born in California. She lived in Western Europe and the Soviet Union from the age of 22 until her death at age 50. She performed to acclaim throughout Europe. Duncan's fondness for flowing scarves contributed to her death in an automobile accident in Nice, France, when she was a passenger in an Amilcar. Her silk scarf, draped around her neck, became entangled around the open-spoked wheels and rear axle, breaking her neck. In 1987, she was inducted into the National Museum of Dance's Mr. and Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney Hall of Fame. Early life. Angela Isadora Duncan was born at 501 Taylor Street in San Francisco, California to Joseph Charles Duncan, a banker, mining engineer and connoisseur of the arts, and Mary Isadora Gray. Duncan was the youngest of 4 children. Her 2 brothers were Augustin Duncan and Raymond Duncan. Her sister, Elizabeth Duncan, was also a dancer. Soon after Isadora's birth, her father was exposed in illegal bank dealings, and the family became extremely poor. Her parents were divorced when she was an infant, and her mother moved with her family to Oakland. She worked there as a seamstress and piano teacher. In her early years, Duncan did attend school, but, finding it to be constricting to her individuality, she dropped out. As her family was very poor, she and her 3 siblings taught dance classes to local children to earn extra money. In 1896, Duncan became part of Augustin Daly's theatre company in New York. She soon became disillusioned with the form. Her father, along with his 3rd wife and a daughter, died in 1898 when the British passenger steamer SS Mohegan hit some rocks off the coast of Cornwall. Work. Duncan began her dancing career by teaching lessons in her home from the time she was 6 through her teenage years. Her different approach to dance is evident in these preliminary classes, in which she followed fantasy and improvised, teaching any pretty thing that came into head. Her desire to travel brought Duncan to Chicago, where she auditioned for many theater companies, finally finding a place in Augustin Daly's company. This job took her to New York City, where her unique vision of dance clashed with the popular pantomimes of theater companies. Feeling unhappy and as though her work was not appreciated by the American public, Duncan decided to move to London in 1898. She found work performing in the drawing rooms of the wealthy and drew inspiration from the Greek vases and bas-reliefs in the British Museum. The money she earned from these engagements allowed her to rent a dance studio to develop her work and create larger performances for the stage. From London, Duncan traveled to Paris, where she drew inspiration from the Louvre and the Exposition Universelle of 1900. One day in 1902, Roy Fuller visited Duncan's studio in Paris and invited Duncan to tour with her. This took Duncan all over Europe, creating new works using her innovative dance technique. This style consisted of a focus on natural movement instead of the rigid technique of ballet. She spent most of the rest of her life in this manner, touring in Europe as well as North and South America, where she performed to mixed critical reviews. Despite the critics' mixed reactions, she became quite popular for her distinct style and inspired many visual artists, such as Antoine Bourdelle, Auguste Rodin, Arnold Ronnebeck, and Abraham Wolkowitz, to create works based on her. Duncan disliked the commercial aspects of public performance like touring and contracts because she felt they distracted her from her real mission, the creation of beauty and the education of the young. To achieve her mission, she opened schools to teach young women her dance philosophy. The first was established in 1904 in Grunewald, Germany. This institution was the birthplace of the Isadorables, Anna, Maria Theresa, Irma, Liesel, Gretel, Erika, Isabel and Temple, Duncan's protégés, who would go on to continue her legacy. Later, Duncan established a school in Paris that was shortly closed closed due to the outbreak of World War I. In 1910, Duncan met the occultist Aleister Crowley at a party where he refers to Duncan under the name Lavinia King. He would use the same invented name for her in his novel Moonchild. Crowley wrote of Duncan, "Isadora Duncan has this gift of gesture in a very high degree. Let the reader study her dancing, if possible in private than in public, and learn the superb unconsciousnesses which is magical consciousness, with which she suits the action to the melody." Crowley was in fact more attracted to Duncan's bohemian companion Mary Dempsey, married to Dusty. Dusty had come to Paris in 1901 where she soon met Duncan. The two became inseparable friends. Dusty also appeared in Moonchild as Lisa Ledoux-Ferrier. She joined Crowley's occult order, helping him to write his magnum opus Magic, Book 4 under her magical name of Soror Veracum. She also co-edited 4 numbers of Crowley's journal The Equinox and contributed several collaborative plays to the journal. Mary Dusty wrote a memoir of her experiences with Duncan that includes some autobiographical material, The Untold Story, The Life of Isadora Duncan 1921 to 1927. A terrible irony of the relationship is that the scarf that accidentally killed Duncan was a gift from Dusty. In 1911, the French fashion designer Paul Poiret rented a mansion called Pavillon du Boutard in Le Sault-Saint-Cloud and threw lavish parties, including one of the more famous Grands Fêtes on the 20th of June 1912, La Fête de Bacchus. Isadora Duncan, wearing a Hellenic evening gown designed by Poiret, danced on tables among 300 guests and 900 bottles of champagne were consumed until the first light of day. Duncan, said to have posed for the photographer Edward Muybridge, placed an emphasis on evolutionary dance motion, insisting that each movement was born from the one that preceded it, that each movement gave rise to the next, and so on in organic succession. Her dancing defined the force of progress, change, abstraction and liberation. In France, as elsewhere, Duncan delighted her audience. In 1914, Duncan moved to the United States and transferred the school there. A townhouse on Gramercy Park was provided for its use, and its studio was nearby on the northeast corner of 23rd Street and 4th Avenue, which is now Park Avenue South. Otto Kahn, the head of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., gave Duncan use of the very modern Century Theatre at West 60th Street and Central Park West for her performances and productions, which included a staging of Oedipus Rex, which involved almost all of Duncan's extended entourage and friends. Duncan had been due to leave the U.S. in 1915 on board the RMS Lusitania on the voyage on which it sank, but historians believe her financial situation at the time drove her to choose a more modest crossing. In 1921, her leftist sympathies took her to the Soviet Union where she founded a school in Moscow. However, the Soviet government's failure to follow through on promises to support her work caused her to move west and leave the school to earn philosophy and technique. Breaking with convention, Duncan imagined she had traced the art of dance back to its roots as a sacred art. She developed within this notion free and natural movements inspired by the classical Greek arts, folk dances, social dances, nature and natural forces, as well as an approach to the new American athleticism which included skipping, running, jumping, leaping and tossing. Duncan's philosophy of dance moved away from rigid ballet technique and towards what she perceived as natural movement. To restore dance to a high art form instead of entertainment, she sought the connection between emotions and movement. "I spent long days and nights in the studio seeking that dance which might be the divine expression of the human spirit through the medium of the body's movement." Quote, She believed dance was meant to encircle all that life had to offer, joy and sadness. Duncan took inspiration from ancient Greece and combined it with an American love of freedom. Her movement was feminine and came from within the deepest feelings of her body. This is exemplified in her revolutionary costume of a white Greek tunic and bare feet. Inspired by Greek forms, her tunics also allowed a freedom of movement corseted ballet costumes and pointe shoes did not. Costumes were not the only inspiration Duncan took from Greece. She was very inspired by ancient Greek art and utilized some of those forms in her movement. Duncan wrote of American dancing, "Let them come forth with great strides, leaps and bounds, with lifted forehead and far-spread arms, to dance." Quote, her focus on natural movement emphasized steps, such as skipping, outside of codified ballet technique. Duncan also cited the sea as an early inspiration for her movement. Also, she believed movement originated from the solar plexus, which she thought was the source of all movement. It is this philosophy and new dance technique that garnered Duncan the title of the creator of modern dance. Personal life. Both in her professional and private lives, Duncan flouted traditional mores and morality. She was bisexual and alluded to her communism during her last United States tour. In 1922-23, Duncan waved a red scarf and bared her breast on stage in Boston, proclaiming, "This is red. So am I." Duncan was an atheist and bore 2 children, both out of wedlock. The first, Deirdre Beatrice, by theatre designer Gordon Craig, and the second, Patrick Augustus, by Paris Singer, one of the many sons of sewing machine magnate Isaac Singer. Both children died in an accident on the Seine River on April 19, 1913. The children were in the car with the nurse, returning home after lunch with Duncan and Paris Singer. The driver stalled the car while attempting to avoid a collision with another car. He got out to hand-crank the engine, but forgot to set the parking brake. The car rolled across the Boulevard.Born, down the embankment and into the river. The children and the nanny drowned. Following the accident, Duncan spent several months recuperating in Corfu with her brother and sister. After this, she spent several weeks at the Viareggio seaside resort with actress Eleonora Duse. The fact that Duse had just left a relationship with the rebellious and epicene young feminist Lena Paletti fueled speculation as to the nature of Duncan and Duse's relationship, but there has never been an indication the two were involved romantically. In her autobiography, Duncan relates that she begged a young Italian stranger, the sculptor Romano Romanelli, to sleep with her because of her desperation to have another baby. She did become pregnant after the deaths of her elder 2 children and gave birth on August 13, 1914 to a son who died shortly after birth. In 1921, after the close of the Russian Revolution, Duncan moved to Moscow where she met the acclaimed poet Sergei Esnin, who was 18 years her junior. On the 2nd of May 1922 they married and Esnin accompanied her on a tour of Europe and the United States. However, the marriage was brief, and in May 1923 he left Duncan and returned to Moscow. 2 years later, on the 28th of December 1925, Esnin was found dead in his room in the Hotel Angleterre in St. Petersburg in an apparent suicide. Duncan had a relationship with poet and playwright Mercedes da Costa, which is documented in numerous revealing letters they wrote to each other. In one she wrote, "Mercedes, lead me with your little strong hands and I will follow you to the top of a mountain, to the end of the world, wherever you wish. later life. By the end of her life, Duncan's performing career had dwindled and she became as notorious for her financial woes, scandalous love life and all too frequent public drunkenness as for her contributions to the arts. She spent her final years moving between Paris and the Mediterranean, running up debts at hotels. She spent short periods in apartments rented on her behalf by a decreasing number of friends and supporters, many of whom attempted to assist her in writing an autobiography. They hoped it might be successful enough to support her. In a reminiscent sketch, Zelda Fitzgerald wrote how she and F. Scott Fitzgerald, her husband, sat in a Paris cafe watching a somewhat drunk Duncan. He would speak of how memorable it was, but what Zelda recalled was that while all eyes were watching Duncan, Zelda was able to steal the salt and pepper shakers from the table. In his book Isadora, An Intimate Portrait, Sewell Stokes, who met Duncan in the last years of her life, describes her extravagant waywardness. Duncan's autobiography My Life was published in 1927. Composer Percy Grainger called Isadora's autobiography a life-enriching masterpiece. Death. On the night of September 14, 1927 in Nice, France, Duncan was a passenger in an Amilcar automobile owned by Benoit Falchetto, a French-Italian mechanic. She wore a long, flowing, hand-painted silk scarf, created by the Russian-born artist Roman Chatov, a gift from her friend Mary Desti, the mother of American film director Preston Sturges. Desti, who saw Duncan off, had asked Duncan to wear a cape in the open-air vehicle because of the cold weather, but Duncan would only agree to wear the scarf. As they departed, Duncan reportedly said to Desti and some companions, "Adieu, mes amis, je vais à la gloire." But according to American novelist Glenway Westcott, Desti later told him that Duncan's actual last words were, "Je vais à la mort." Desti considered this embarrassing, as it suggested that she and Falchetto were going to her hotel for a tryst. Her silk scarf, draped around her neck, became entangled around the open-spoked wheels and rear axle, hurling her from the open car and breaking her neck. Desti said she called out to warn Duncan about the shawl almost immediately after the car left. Desti brought Duncan to the hospital, where she was declared dead. As the New York Times noted in its obituary, Isadora Duncan, the American dancer, tonight met a tragic death at Nice on the Riviera. According to dispatches from Nice, Ms. Duncan was hurled in an extraordinary manner from an opened automobile in which she was riding and instantly killed by the force of her fall to the stone pavement. Quote, other sources described her death as resulting from strangulation, noting that she was almost decapitated by the sudden tightening of the scarf around her neck. The accident gave rise to Gertrude Stein's mordant remark that affectations can be dangerous. At her death, Duncan was a Soviet citizen. Her will was the first of a Soviet citizen to be probated in the U.S. Duncan was cremated, and her ashes were placed next to those of her children in the Columbarium at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. The headstone of her grave contains the inscription École du Ballet de l'Opéra de Paris, Legacy. While the mother of dances, schools in Europe did not last long, Isadora Duncan's work had impact in the art, and her style is still danced based upon the instruction of Maria Theresa Duncan, Anna Duncan, and Irma Duncan, three of her 6 adopted daughters. Through her sister, Elizabeth, Duncan's approach was adopted by Jarmila Jerebkova from Prague, where her legacy persists. By 1913 she was already being celebrated. When the Tête des Champs-Élysées was built, Duncan's likeness was carved in its bas-relief over the entrance by sculptor Antoine Bourdelle and included in painted murals of the 9 Muses by Maurice Denis in the auditorium. In 1987, she was inducted into the National Museum of Dance and Hall of Fame. Anna, Lisa, Teresa and Irma, pupils of Isadora Duncan's first school, carried on the aesthetic and pedagogical principles of Isadora's work in New York and Paris. Choreographer and dancer Julia Levian was also instrumental in furthering Duncan's work through the formation of the Duncan Dance Guild in the 1950s, and the establishment of the Duncan Centenary Company in 1977. Another means by which Duncan's dance techniques were carried forth was in the formation of the Isadora Duncan Heritage Society by Mignon Garland, who had been taught dance by two of Duncan's key students. Garland was such a fan that she later lived in a building erected at the same site and addresses Duncan, attached commemorative plaque near the entrance, which is still there as of 2016. Garland also succeeded in having San Francisco rename an alley on the same block from Adelaide Place to Isadora Duncan Lane. An unwitting legacy of Duncan was to give the medical profession the injury known as the Isadora Duncan syndrome, which results when an article of clothing or hair becomes entangled in a piece of machinery, a moving object. The injury is common in India, where flowing garments become entangled in the wheels of rickshaws.